But in this very first seance anyway, I saw small flashes of light behind the medium. I saw a weird transformation of the medium's facial features, and this sort of like a green mask that kind of appeared over the medium's face. And it kind of looked like, I always say it looked kind of like a Chinese monk, kind of a stereotypical image of a Chinese monk.
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the status of spiritual entities, their ontological status. How real are they? My guest is Dr. Jack Hunter. He is the author of many books, including, most recently, Spirits, Gods, and Magic, an introduction to the Anthropology of the Supernatural. He is also editor of a volume titled Greening the Paranormal, Exploring the Ecology of Extraordinary Experience. He is the author of Engaging the Anomalous, a collected essays on anthropology, the paranormal, mediumship, and extraordinary experience. He is the founder of the journal Paranthropology, which he founded as a graduate student, and it's been published now for over a decade. He's co-editor with David Luke of the volume Talking with Spirits, Ethnographies from Between the Worlds. He's the editor of Damned Facts, 14 essays on religion, folklore, and the paranormal. He's also the editor of Strange Dimensions, a Paranthropology anthology. He is the author of The Paranormal, Why People Believe in Spirits, Gods, and Magic. And he works as a tutor with the Sophia Center for the Study of Cosmology and Culture at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. This, of course, is an internet interview, and I'll switch over now to the internet video. Welcome, Jack. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
It's a pleasure to be back again. Thanks for having me.
We're going to be talking about a topic that I think is of great interest to our viewers. Essentially, how shall we regard spirits? Are they figments of our imagination? Are they natural phenomenon just as real as you and me, or somewhere in between? And this is a question that has troubled anthropologists, I guess, going back over a century.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if we look back to the very earliest, the fact that we call them the founding fathers of anthropology, they were interested in questions of the nature of spirit because, they were coming from a very kind of positivistic perspective. They thought that science, had become the kind of like the dominant framework for understanding the world. We're talking like in the 19th century now. And when they were looking out into other cultures, through their colonialist lenses, because obviously it was it was the empire that was, giving people access to all of these different people. They were seeing belief in spirits people who were practicing, rituals in order to, incorporate spirits and spirit possession practices and that kind of thing, And then these early anthropologists were looking at this and, trying to make sense of it in terms of their framework. And their framework obviously was that, this has got to be wrong. This kind of thing can't be happening. Our scientific materialist worldview gives us, our complete picture of reality, and there's no room in it for spirits. So the early anthropologists often tried to come up with, theories, different strategies to try and explain away these spirits which were problematic for them. So E.B. Tyler's famous explanation was that, the belief in spirits arises, because primitive, early human beings had misinterpreted, dreams and other kinds of altered states of consciousness as real experiences. And he's coming at that with the preconceived idea that, anything that comes through altered states of consciousness and things like that has got to be, false. It doesn't fit in with their worldview. Yeah, so right from the very beginning, anthropologists have been, encountering these different systems, these different ideas about the nature of spirits and different gods and deities and things, but usually trying to explain it away in terms that don't kind of clash with the dominant materialist worldview.
And at the same time, though, at the 19th century, you had the Society for Psychical Research being formed, and some very prominent researchers looking seriously at the existence of spirits. That also must have had an impact upon some anthropologists.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Lang, for example, he's kind of one of my heroes in a way. He came up with this idea of comparative psychical research. So on the one hand, he was a folklorist and an anthropologist, and he would collect fairy stories. He's famous for his collections of fairy stories. And then on the other hand, he became president of the SPR for a time. And he was deeply interested in psychical research and the developments that were taking place in that field, and kind of like a predecessor to this lineage of paranthropology that I've been involved in. Trying to encourage anthropologists of his day to take seriously the literature that was coming out of psychical research, but also trying to get the psychical researchers who were only really looking at spirit mediumship in London and places like that, Western mediumship, to think about the wider context as well. The different cultures around the world that were doing different kinds of practices, but that maybe had similar underlying processes and that kind of thing. So there were two different trajectories within anthropology right from the very beginning. There was one that was interested in reducing these experiences down and explaining them away in materialist terms, and then there was the kind of Andrew Lang side of things that was more interested in exploring the possibility that spirits might be real and that there might be scientific ways that we can investigate these things.
Yeah, how far did the Andrew Lang school get? I know he's been a big influence on you, but over the last century, has he been very influential?
He kind of ebbs in and out of favor, which kind of happens a lot with these kind of liminal characters. Because he was between psychical research and anthropology, so he's never really fully in one camp or the other. But there were efforts in the 1960s and 70s to bring anthropology and parapsychology together, and they would look back into the literature in exactly the same way that I did, and they would find Andrew Lang and hold him up as this, as a hero, because he was promoting this comparative psychical research, way back in the 19th century. And so really, all of the paranthropology and transpersonal anthropology and all of that kind of stuff really starts with Andrew Lang, I guess.
Now, I gather that a number of anthropologists sort of took a middle ground, which is to say that rather than judge whether spirits are real or not in a physical sense or a naturalistic or biological sense, they say, why don't we consider them real psychological phenomenon or real sociological phenomenon?
Yeah. I mean, I guess this falls into the category of like relativism and all that kind of stuff. Towards the end of the 19th century, when anthropologists started to move away from the kind of colonialist kind of attitudes of people like Tyler, and they started to do actual field work, they would go into the field and actually live with people. And they would move away from, those old Victorian anthropologists were considered like armchair anthropologists. That's what they would do. They would sit in their libraries looking through the accounts of missionaries and explorers and things like that, and come up with these grand theories of, social evolution based on these secondhand accounts. So the new generation of anthropologists, which was, be epitomized by people like Bronislaw Malinowski in Britain, well, he was, Polish-British, and also Franz Boas in America. They would go and they would actually do field work with people and live with them. And what they found was that, what the Victorian anthropologists have thought of as kind of like primitive, superstitious, irrational, actually, when you lived in those systems, they made perfect sense. And they were, it was a perfectly rational way of living in the world and of understanding the world, making sense of different kinds of things like, misfortunes and things like that. So these guys, through living with people, found that actually magic and all of this kind of stuff wasn't primitive, it wasn't irrational, and it wasn't, I can't remember who said it, I think it was Evans-Pritchard, it wasn't irreconcilable with a rational appreciation of nature. Okay, so they were, rational people, but they also included spirit beliefs into their rational systems. So relativism then becomes like a strategy, again, for sort of accepting the fact that these are rational systems, by saying that we can't judge one culture against another. But also relativism comes with a kind of, it's almost as though it's still trying to reduce it down or still trying to protect the kind of Western model. Because it's saying, there are different systems that we can't compare with each other, but our system is obviously the best one, the scientific materialist worldview.
I imagine they might have also been influenced by William James and C.S. Pearson, the philosophy of pragmatism, the sort of, if it works for these people, it's true for them, and that's good enough.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of the line of thinking, and it's not necessarily concerned with whether it's true or not. And this is kind of like the standard approach that anthropologists have taken for the last, 50 or 60 years. But this is the problem that I find with that kind of approach, is that it always gets to a certain point, it gets so far, and it's like these people believe in this stuff, and then, but it can't actually be, it can't be real. It can be culturally real, it could be psychologically real or socially real, but it can't be, ontologically real.
Well, that's the question I want to push on. You began your career by investigating spiritualists in England, and you had a lot of firsthand experience yourself.
Yeah, my fieldwork was with a group of developing trance and physical mediums in Bristol, and they were in this private home circle where they would meet regularly over weeks and months, and ultimately over years as well, to develop trance mediumship and to try and produce, physical phenomena like ectoplasm and levitations and that kind of stuff. And the very first seance that I attended with them was actually quite an interesting one for me, because I had a few experiences that seemed to accord with their worldview. I'm going to put it in that way. It was my very first seance as well, so it's just strange the way it all seemed to pan out. And gradually over time, I stopped having as extraordinary experiences. Kind of like a decline effect seemed to be in action. But in this very first seance anyway, I saw small flashes of light behind the medium. I saw a weird transformation of the medium's facial features, and this sort of like a green mask that kind of appeared over the medium's face. And it kind of looked like, I always say it looked kind of like a Chinese monk, kind of a stereotypical image of a Chinese monk. It was a really strange experience because it was very kind of like hallucinatory. It felt like a hallucination. And I thought, I'm going to keep this to myself. I'm not going to tell anyone else about it. But then, after the seance, after we'd spoken to a few spirits, we went back out into the house to have, tea and biscuits and that kind of thing. And someone else, one of the other sitters in the seance, independently said, did you see that green Chinese monk's face? And I was just like, I did see that Chinese monk's face, but it felt like a hallucination. So, it opened up this, my very first seance included a kind of like a shared hallucination, which is pretty weird. But, having those kind of experiences, it blows open those kind of relativistic kind of frameworks and things like that. Because now you've got to confront this, yourself. You've got to deal with how do you fit these experiences that you've had into your, worldview. Are you going to ignore them like people like Tyler might have done, or try and explain them away, or we're going to explore them, on their own terms and that kind of thing. I think that's the kind of direction that I've gone in.
Now, I gather you worked with this group for a period of many months, maybe even years.
Yeah, it was most intensely for a couple of years, and then gradually, I stopped going to seances and I stopped attending. But I'm still in touch with the circle leader, and I still have questions for her every now and again. But yeah, it was a long-term thing. My whole PhD took over like 7 or 8 years, quite a long time.
And so during that period, the spirits would come through a medium who's in a trance state, and you would engage in conversations with these ostensible spirits.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I wanted to try and do was to use the spirits themselves as ethnographic informants, so to talk to the spirits, at the very least as if they were, real spirits. And actually, I think they're more than just as if. But that was my approach at the time, just to treat them as if they were real entities. So I would go to the seances. One of the most interesting things about the process of communicating with them, and this is something that I've been thinking about recently, was how the seance is kind of like a ritual. It's kind of like a ritual for bringing these spirits into social reality. So, they do all sorts of different things. The mediums will go into altered states. The sitters around will probably also go into altered states because they've got, dimmed lighting, there's music on, and all of these kind of things are all going on at the same time. And then the process of bringing spirits out of the medium is kind of like I've been characterizing it recently as a kind of like a nurturing process. And it could take it could take weeks or months for an individual spirit to make itself fully manifest. And the mediums will, to begin with, if a spirit is trying to make itself known through the body, the medium might be twitching or having small spasms and things like that. And then the circle leader picks up on those tiny movements and says, right, the spirit is trying to make itself known here. So we'll focus in on that and we'll encourage it. So it'll be like, okay, move the finger again and things like that. And then gradually over time, it might be one seance, it might be just the finger moves. And then the next seance, the finger moves and then the arm lifts up. And then the next seance, a voice starts to come through. So it's a very slow and gradual kind of process. And I've been thinking recently about how more kind of like organic, processual kind of approaches, organic ways of understanding might be a better fit. So, in like the 19th century with mediumship, they were talking about things like the spiritual telegraph and that kind of thing. And they were applying, technological, mechanistic kind of metaphors to understanding it. But that's not the experience that I had with mediumship. It wasn't like they were tuning in and they were picking up a spirit that was definitively there. It was more like they were nurturing it like a kind of like a seed or an embryo or something like that. So, my line of thinking about mediumship has changed a lot recently to incorporate this more organic way of thinking. But yeah, that's how the spirits came to be, fully social participants in the group. And then I would interview them.
I would imagine that in order for this to even work at the sociological level, the spirits have to maintain a consistent personality.
Exactly, yeah. Because they're trying to build up a solid image of the personality that they are. And the circle leader will, would record the seances, and she would come back and check them, for consistency, over weeks and months. And eventually you'd end up with these, consistent personalities that you could have a conversation with, just kind of like they become persons in the same way that, anyone else is a person. It's really interesting. And then it opens up this, our understanding of seances into these kind of like they're social situations where everyday people have interactions with spirits or beings from whatever they are. It's pretty amazing stuff.
I come from a family where my mother was in the theater. And so she would be able to go into different characters and portray them. And I've seen how certain characters influenced my mother in her whole personality and her outlook on life. They had a real presence in our family, but they were fictional characters, and she was an actress.
I think there's something interesting about acting and performance, more generally. Our Western way of thinking about acting and performance is that it is just putting on an act. That's what we say. It's fake. But there are other traditions where performance is actually more of a kind of like a transformation. So perhaps the characters that your mother was enacting, they were imaginary, but in the moment that they're being enacted, they become actual. And this is a nice idea that Lawrence Lasham talked about, this idea of functional entities. And he borrowed this idea from mathematics. But he was trying to understand, I think it was Eileen Garrett's spirit guide, Uvani. And he said something like, Uvani is this figure that he doesn't exist until the moment when he does exist. And he exists for his particular function at that time. And then, he only exists when he exists. I think that's a pretty cool way of thinking about it.
Well, Eileen Garrett was a great medium who was studied over decades by different researchers and showed various physiological effects when she went into trance, and all sorts of information would come through her that wasn't available to her conscious mind at all. That she seemed to know. So there are many examples like that in the history of the study of mediumship. I thought one of the most fascinating examples you reported on had to do with women. I believe a female anthropologist, perhaps male, I'm not sure offhand, but in doing field work and becoming initiated into mediumship or sorcery in various indigenous cultures and witnessing firsthand many things that would seem completely outside the realm of the Western mindset, such as the reanimation of a corpse.
Yes. What was the name of the anthropologist? Bruce Grindle. That's it, Bruce Grindle. Yeah, he was an anthropologist, and he was writing in the kind of 1980s, I think. And he went, and there had been a murder. I can't remember where exactly in the world it was, but there had been a murder in the village. So they had to do this kind of a divination to find out who the murderer was. And the point of it was to kind of like resurrect the corpse, and the corpse would reveal who the killer was, if I'm remembering it correctly. But the interesting thing about Bruce Grindle's account of this experience is that he describes it in real intricate ethnographic detail. And he talks about his own experiences of being like sleep deprived and all of these kind of things, and how all of that kind of led into it. And then he's involved in the ritual performance at the end, and he sees these strands of light appearing, I mean, it's very similar in some ways, not with the resurrecting corpse, but to the kind of experiences that I had in the onset of my own anomalous extraordinary experiences. Yeah, and then these strands of light would move around the body, and they reanimated in it, and it was, from what I remember, the corpse was dancing and playing the drums and that kind of thing. But, there are these kinds of experiences are recounted in the ethnographic literature all over the place. There's extraordinary encounters with orbs of light in deserts, and even anthropologists that we think of as kind of like the founding fathers, or the kind of like the standard texts that we read, like Evans-Pritchard, even E.B. Tyler had extraordinary experiences. They just don't always include it in their ethnographies, or they do and they try to explain it away in really mundane terms. But yeah, there's a lot of that kind of super extraordinary experiences in anthropology.
And I think it's fair to say that in the history of psychical research, there are many eminent psychical researchers who also report extraordinary phenomenon and are totally convinced as a result of their experiences of the reality of the spiritual world. People like Sir Oliver Lodge, who are at the very height of British scientific society, became convinced spiritualists.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it just makes you, it makes you think, if these people were so convinced, what is it that had convinced them? And for me, it makes me want to go out into the field to find out, to have those kind of experiences. I think that's an interesting point, actually, about psychical research as it was practiced in the 19th century, and then what eventually became parapsychology, in the 20th century. As in the 19th century, psychical research was actually a lot more like anthropology. The psychical researcher would go to a haunted house, or they would go out and they would do the investigations. And then gradually, as we move into the 20th century, parapsychology becomes more and more laboratory based, and we're looking for, statistical evidence for the existence of psi. We call it psi and not spirits and things like that. So, I think that's part of the reason the culture was different in the 19th century. And, they were experiencing more extraordinary phenomena because the culture was ripe for it. And actually, as time has gone on, our culture has kind of shut these things out. And by not talking about them, we kind of dwindle them as well.
I'm under the impression that J.B. Rhine in the 1930s made a definite effort to move away from spiritualism and its investigation. I think he was a little bit intimidated by the possibilities of fraud and by some of the colorful personalities like Minna Crandon, who was a famous spiritualist medium of the 1920s and 30s, who I think Rhine looked into and felt a little off-put by her flirtatiousness.
Yeah, I know, yeah. He was involved in the Marjorie mediumship, wasn't he?
Exactly. Her real name was Minna Crandon, but she was known as Marjorie, yeah.
And they found that her ectoplasm was like animal intestines and that kind of thing. It's interesting, yeah, there is that whole side of physical mediumship and the spiritualist movement. It just became, forever tainted by fraud, and but people would think about it only in those terms and forget the possibilities, that the like white crow possibilities that some of these mediums might actually have been able to produce really weird phenomena.
Well, in your experience working with a spiritualist circle for years, did you have a reason to ever question their sincerity? There
was two different kinds of mediums that I encountered during my fieldwork. On the one hand, there was the mediums that would come to the lodge on a regular basis, weekly mediums, and they were really dedicated to it. And they wouldn't be paid for it. It was kind of part of their own spiritual development in a way, and then we could come and sit and talk to them. But, it was on their time. No money's been exchanged. They're doing it for the love of developing trance, which is fair enough. And then on the other side of the coin, there are the mediums who do like guest demonstrations, and they will go to different lodges, and you might have to pay like a £30 fee or something to for their transport and that kind of thing. But for these kind of mediums, it's more of like a job. And I went to a couple of seances like this, and although there were some strange things going on in the seances, they had a completely different kind of a vibe, and I couldn't help but think that with this particular medium that there was something else going on, that wasn't not paranormal, basically, that there was tricks involved. But at the same time, I'm aware that in shamanistic traditions and all of this kind of stuff, trickery, magic, fraud, and all of that kind of stuff is totally intertwined with the genuine side of things as well. So shamans will use sleight of hand and things like that in order to produce, alterations of people's consciousness, to change their perceptions of reality. And it's in those moments then when some genuine things might happen. So this is the kind of, when you start to entertain these possibilities, then it's not possible to totally denounce, like a seance as fraudulent. Like there may have been elements of it that I thought were tricks or things like that. But at the same time, how do I know that they're not part of the kind of the medium's, repertoire, his toolbox for inducing altered states and things in the sitters? So, so there's a fine line that needs exploring with the performance and reality kind of thing.
Well, I think it's fair to say that if you were to question parapsychologists today overall, you would find that they're sort of split down the middle with regard to the ontological status of spirits. Most parapsychologists, I think, would admit that we haven't been able to absolutely, even in the most extreme manifestations, rule out the possibility that the phenomenon are produced not by the spirits of the deceased or other worldly entities, but by the psychic powers of living people who are present.
Yeah, it's called the psi versus super psi, or spirits versus super psi debate. Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one. How can we definitively prove that we are receiving information from a discarnate spirit, or whether we're receiving information telepathically from some unknown, non-physical source? I mean, I think probably the truth is, when we have these kind of dichotomies, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. So, spirits and psi and telepathy and all of that kind of stuff are probably intimately connected. There needs to be some kind of a mechanism for spirits to exist. So, psi and telepathy are going to be involved somewhere along the line anyway. So it just becomes really I don't know whether we will ever be able to fully disentangle psi and spirits from each other. But I think in a way it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater to say that spirits are not involved.
I think it's interesting to look at some of the strongest cases for the ontological reality of spirits. One of those we've reported on extensively on our YouTube channel. I call it the chess game from beyond the grave, a case, I believe it's from Sweden, where a spirit medium was asked if they could find a deceased chess player who would play a game of chess with a living grand master. And that actually occurred. A complete game of chess was played with the living master, Victor Korchnoi, and the supposed dead spirit of a renowned chess player who died in 1954, decades earlier, named Geza Maraksi, who was a Hungarian, as I recall. And the deceased Hungarian chess player lost the match, but people analyze it move by move, and they say this was a game of chess played with a skill level well beyond that of the medium. It was played at the grandmaster level. So that would seem to imply not just information being communicated, but a unique skill that it's hard to explain that in terms of super psi.
Yeah, a hint of the kind of personality or something like that, the character of the spirit. This is the kind of thing, though, that I think anthropologists need to become aware of, because there's all of this extraordinary data in psychical research and parapsychology, and there are these strong cases that suggest, discarnate spirits or whatever we want to call them, spirits. And, usually, in anthropology of spirit mediumship and spirit possession and that kind of stuff, the explanations only go so far as, like psychological explanations and social explanations. They resort to social functionalism to explain, but they totally ignore the possibility that, parapsychology and psychical research suggest that in some certain circumstances with exceptional people, there is this, connection to something that seems to be real out there. And, all of our anthropological and ethnographic theories that ignore all that kind of stuff will perhaps one day have to be totally, reevaluated in light of the existence of the spiritual world, which is pretty cool.
And of course, I think from a theoretical level, people are looking at such things as higher dimensions of space that make the possibility of a spiritual world begin to seem more probable, I think, or at least not as much in conflict with conventional science.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these kind of trajectories of, like you're saying, high dimensional physics and the different, the possibilities of these different dimensions, but then also relating it back to, traditional ecological knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge systems, which have always been, multi-world models, multiple intelligences, different kinds of spirit interactions and relationships between our world and invisible worlds. So, it's an interesting time that we're living in, where these different, different traditions are starting to reveal something, maybe solid.
Another thing that intrigues me is I know towards the end of the 19th century, people like Sir William Crookes reported seances in which there were full-bodied spirit materializations that would occur. And I have interviewed an investigative journalist, Leslie Kane, who's written a book on survival after death. She reports that she's witnessed the very same phenomenon today.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Ectoplasm is a strange thing. One of the things that I was interested in, because I was looking at it, spiritualism from a cross-cultural perspective, was to try and find out if there are, any cross-cultural parallels with ectoplasm. It seems like a uniquely European kind of Western spiritualist concept. It's a physical substance that is spiritual at the same time. But, I looked through the literature and I couldn't find much on it, but I did find a couple of interesting things that sounded kind of similar to ectoplasm. One of them was Edith Turner's experience with extracting this grey plasma-like blob from the back of an afflicted patient. And that sounded a little bit like ectoplasm, but it wasn't like forming shapes or limbs or anything like that. Another was a kind of magical phlegm that's produced by ayahuasqueros. So, shamans who consume ayahuasca would produce this magical phlegm, and they could get small objects out of it, like arrowheads and things like that, poison darts and stuff. So that sounded a little bit like ectoplasm as well. And then another really interesting one was an Aboriginal Australian account. I think it was an anthropologist called Ronald Rose that described it. And they were talking about this rope that the medicine men would produce. They would pull it out of their mouths, a rope that would move independently, kind of like a snake. And he was saying that the anthropologist and the Westerners, they couldn't see this magical rope. but the other tribe members could see this thing moving around and they were describing it. So they were arguing that there might have been some kind of a psychic component to the manifestation of the magical rope, the ectoplasm. So although it seems like a uniquely Western idea, there are actually cross-cultural, parallels as well, which make it, again, that little bit more interesting. It seems so strange that it should, if it's just a cultural thing, that it should emerge like that.
But it does seem that the phenomenon are shaped by cultural expectations.
Definitely they are. Yeah. I mean, one just sticking with ectoplasm for a minute, I've also thought about ectoplasm as a unique cultural manifestation, because if you think about 19th century society, people talk about a schism between science and religion and all of that kind of stuff going on in the 19th century, and Darwinism and all of that is taking off. And you can think about groups like the Society for Psychical Research as kind of like trying to bridge the gap between science and spirituality, or science and religion. And they needed something, they needed something that bridged that gap. And ectoplasm kind of fulfills that role. It's a physical substance that you can take a sample of and take into the lab, but it's also connected to the spiritual world. It's the kind of like the juncture between this world and the spiritual world. So you could also think maybe of ectoplasm as kind of like a thought form, or something that Victorian society needed in order to bridge the gap between science and spirituality. So it is definitely influenced by culture as well. But there's also a pre-cultural thing going on too.
Another aspect of psychical research that has always fascinated me is what is known as the cross correspondences, where it seems as if a particular spiritual entity, such as the deceased researcher F.W.H. Myers, would appear through different mediums on different continents with messages that only seemed to make sense when you took them and put them all together like pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah, and fragments of poetry and things, because he was a classicist, so he'd have fragments of ancient Greek poetry coming through one medium on one side of the world in India, and then one coming through in London, and the only thing, like you're saying before, things that seem to hint at the character of the person coming through as well, more than just sigh.
And another interesting contemporary example of that, which I'm aware, is we were referring to the Marjorie mediumship, which attracted enormous public attention in the 1920s, I think in 1930s, across the United States. Harry Houdini was involved. The Scientific American was going to offer an award for proof of spiritual reality. I think they nearly gave it to her until Houdini intervened and he insisted it was fraud. But her spirit guide was supposedly her deceased brother, Walter. Now, it turns out, according to Leslie Kane, that this very same spirit, Walter, is now speaking through a medium in the United Kingdom, Stuart Alexander, who is producing physical phenomena very much akin to the phenomenon attributed to the Marjorie mediumship so long ago.
There are a few spirits like that seem to come through. Key figures from psychical research seem to come through. You also get the odd kind of like celebrity as well coming through in seances. And there are certain characters that are really, distinctive characters that it's easy for them to express themselves. I'm going to put it that way. Like people like Louis Armstrong I've encountered. And in the UK, there's a comedian called Tommy Cooper. He wears like a little red fez. People like that. So, it's tricky. I think it's tricky whether these are actually the people that they claim they are, or whether there are just, on the one hand, it might be the mediums themselves creating these characters from distinctive personalities that are easy to enact, or it could be, discarnate spirits doing exactly the same thing, using, an kind of like an archetype of a character, a very distinctive person like Winston Churchill, for example, and using that in order to express themselves. But, I don't know definitively whether these spirits are who they claim to be or not.
I'm sure it's very tricky in many, many cases, but let me ask you this question, Jack. If you had to put a probability figure on it, what would you say is the probability in your estimation, after having researched this phenomenon for many, many years, that such a thing as autonomous spirits actually are, I'm going to call them a natural phenomenon? That someday we will understand them as a natural part of the world.
And if I was going to put a probability on it, I would say that it's probably pretty certain. I mean, just sticking with, last time we spoke about ecology and the paranormal. When we look at the living world around us, plants, the trees, the rocks, all of these things, these entities that are out there, they also have consciousness. So, we don't have to look far to see that there are other forms of consciousness out there. The things that we live with around us that we take for granted, like, the plants in the garden, also possess a form of consciousness that we haven't really, engaged with. So, I think when it comes to these questions of whether there are spirits, like external spirits, non-physical spirits out there, I think we need to take a step back a little bit and engage with the spirits that are actually manifest here around us, the different forms of consciousness, and then perhaps it'll lead us into, a more nuanced understanding of these non-physical spirits. And if we can't get our heads around the intelligence of plants, the consciousness of trees and things like that, then how are we going to comprehend, non-physical intelligence?
You cited quite a bit of research having to do with plants. In particular, the research, I think her name is Gagliano.
Monica Gagliano, yeah.
Monica Gagliano has done some fascinating research in the area of plant consciousness, and even, as I recall, learning in plants.
Yeah, which suggests memory as well.
Memory and conditioned responses. But now you also said rocks.
Yeah. Well, I think, we can extrapolate from, it seems like to me, human beings, for a lot, I'm going to have a little grand theory here, that human beings were at one time, animals, that we were enmeshed within the world and we understood it from the inside. And then gradually we have moved away from that and we've sort of separated ourselves from nature. We've become kind of like obsessed with culture, with our own systems that we've created, and have forgotten to engage with that kind of stuff. And then through science, interestingly, people have started to re-engage with very small pockets of the world. So you have one scientist who spends all of their career investigating like lichen or something, and another scientist who spends all of their career investigating plants. And then, through that process of engaging with them again on a very personal kind of like one-to-one level, we're realizing or kind of like re-remembering the other intelligence of these things, the consciousness. So we do that with, first we start to engage with the cats and things, things that live around us, that live in our homes, that we have easy access to. And then we expand that outwards and we start to engage with trees and things like that. And people have all sorts of amazing experiences engaging with trees. And then you expand it again and you start to spend time with rocks and, the things that we usually consider as non-living elements of the environment. But it's the engagement and the interaction with things that brings out the thing inside, the life inside of it. I actually think it's a very similar process to what the mediumship development is all about. In focusing in on the little movements and twitches and building it up, it's about building a relationship with that particular spirit. And it's the same with the rocks as well. So if we spend our time with a particular rock, engage with it, feel it, and all of that kind of stuff. I know it sounds wishy-washy, but we genuinely do. Then we start to build up a new relationship with the rock, and it starts to takes on the semblance of persons in just the same way as the spirits do through interaction. So I think rocks probably we will end up with some kind of a panpsychism.
What you're saying is the teaching of mystics of almost every culture that we are all one and that we share one consciousness. So when we talk about the idea of other spirits, it's almost paradoxical in a way that there could be more than one consciousness.
This is an interesting thing, though, as well. I mean, in ecology, when we look at ecosystems tend towards increased diversity, and lots of species makes up, a strong ecosystem. So although we have like the ecosystem as a wholeness or a one, also within that there's a whole array of diversity and difference, and it's that diversity and difference that gives the whole its strength in a way. So I think, although mystics talk about oneness and unity and all of that kind of stuff, I don't think it necessarily it doesn't get rid of the difference and the diversity and the all of the different kinds of things that are going on in the world.
Well, Jack Hunter, this has been a fascinating discussion. I don't think we've necessarily gotten to the very bottom of this issue. It may be going to take several more decades of exploration for researchers to get a real handle on the idea of autonomous spiritual entities as part of the natural world. But I have to commend you for thinking deeply about the problem and pushing other people in your profession of anthropology to think deeply about it. Jack, thank you so much for being with me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.